My boyfriend dumped me the second he won $15 million, calling me a boring admin who wasn't on his level. He had no idea I was a secret multi-millionaire trader, or that his winning ticket was actually a death sentence. The winning ticket sat on our scarred wooden kitchen table like a holy relic, catching the dim afternoon light that filtered through our cracked window. Mark hadn't moved in 20 minutes. He just stared at it, his breath hitching every few seconds, his hands trembling so violently he had to tuck them under his thighs. I stood by the stove, the smell of cheap boxed pasta filling the air, watching the man I had supported for 3 years finally get what he always claimed he deserved. $15 million, Sarah, he whispered, his voice cracking. It's $15 million. I leaned against the counter, a strange mixture of relief and anxiety swirling in my chest. I know, Mark, it's incredible. We can finally breathe. We can fix the car, pay off your sister's debt, maybe even look at that house in the suburbs you always talk about. He didn't look at me. His eyes remained locked on that small slip of thermal paper. Yeah, he murmured, but his tone had shifted. The warmth that usually accompanied our shared dreams was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp edge of calculation. We can do a lot of things. For the past 3 years, I had been the backbone of our household. While Mark hopped from one entrepreneurial venture to another, mostly multi-level marketing schemes and failed crypto day trading attempts that bled our savings dry, I worked. On paper, I was a mid-level administrative assistant for a logistics firm. I wore thrifted blazers, packed tuna sandwiches for lunch, and took the bus to save on gas. But I had a secret that lived behind a secondary encrypted browser on my laptop and a series of high-stakes brokerage accounts. I wasn't just an admin, I was a god-tier swing trader. I had started with a small inheritance from my grandmother, and through a combination of obsessive research and a preternatural ability to read market volatility, I had turned $5,000 into an amount of money that would make a lottery winner's jaw drop. But I never told Mark. At first, it was because I wanted to see if his business ideas would actually take flight. Later, it was because I saw how he handled money, like water through a sieve. I told myself I was the safety net, waiting for the right moment to reveal that we were already set for life. I wanted us to build something together first, to ensure our relationship was grounded in more than just a balance sheet. That night, Mark didn't touch his pasta. He spent the evening on his phone, pacing the length of our tiny apartment, talking in hushed, urgent tones. He didn't mention the house in the suburbs again. He didn't mention the car. Over the next week, the man I thought I knew disintegrated. He stopped coming home for dinner. When he did show up, he was wearing clothes that cost more than our monthly rent. Items he'd clearly bought on credit, confident in the windfall that was about to hit his bank account. He looked at our furniture with disgust. He looked at my worn-out slippers with an expression that bordered on pity. "You know, Sarah," he said one evening, standing in the middle of our cramped living room while I was trying to study a candlestick chart on my laptop, which he assumed was just me doing data entry for work. People change when they hit this level of success. They outgrow their surroundings. They outgrow their old lives. I closed my laptop slowly, my heart thumping against my ribs. "Is that what you're doing, Mark? Outgrowing your life?" He sighed, a dramatic, weary sound, as if he were a king burdened by his crown. "I just think we need to be realistic. You've been great, really. You stayed through the lean years, but you're comfortable here. You're okay with the bus and the tuna sandwiches. I'm meant for something bigger now. I'm moving in circles you wouldn't even understand." "I see," I said, my voice remarkably steady despite the roar in my ears. "And where do I fit into those circles?" Mark walked over to the closet and pulled out a suitcase I hadn't seen him pack. "That's the thing, Sarah. You don't. I've already signed the lease on a penthouse downtown. I need a clean start. I need to be with people who understand what it means to have this kind of power." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a checkbook, the one linked to the temporary account where his initial lump sum had been deposited. He scribbled something quickly, tore the paper off, and flicked it onto the coffee table. "That's $50,000, he said, his voice devoid of any of the affection he'd whispered into my ear for 3 years. "Consider it a severance package for your services as a girlfriend. Don't try to contact me. My lawyers will handle any claims you think you have on my winnings, but since we aren't married, you aren't entitled to a dime. This is a gift." I looked at the check. $50,000. It was a joke. It was less than I made on a single well-timed put option during a Tuesday morning coffee break. "You're leaving me because you think I'm beneath your new tax bracket?" I asked, looking up at him. "I'm leaving because I've leveled up and you're still playing the tutorial," Mark sneered, grabbing his suitcase. "Stay in your lane, Sarah. It's safer for someone like you." He walked out the door without a backward glance, the heavy thud of the deadbolt echoing in the empty room. I sat there for a long time, the silence of the apartment pressing in on me. I thought about the 3 years of rent I'd paid, the debts of his I'd cleared, and the way I dimmed my own light so he wouldn't feel small. I reached over and opened my laptop. I logged into my primary account. The screen flickered to life, displaying a portfolio balance that had just ticked up due to a late-day rally in tech stocks. The number at the bottom of the screen was $42,780,412. Mark thought he had won the game. He thought he was the one walking away with the prize. He had no idea that he hadn't just left a boring admin. He had just walked away from a fortune 3 times larger than his own, and a woman who was about to make sure his $15 million disappeared faster than he could spend it. I picked up the $50,000 check and tore it into confetti. Then I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd kept in my contacts for a year, a high-end private investigator who specialized in asset protection and aggressive discovery. "It's Sarah," I said when he picked up. "The situation has changed. I need you to find out exactly which bank Mark deposited his winnings into. And then I want you to find his new landlord." But as I began to plan my next move, my phone buzzed with a news alert that made my blood run cold. It wasn't about the stock market. It was a local news headline. "Lottery Commission issues warning. Recent $15 million winning ticket under investigation for potential fraud." My eyes widened as I realized Mark hadn't just left me. He had left me with a ticking time bomb that had our shared address written all over it. The word fraud seemed to pulse on my phone screen, a neon warning sign blinking in the quiet of my living room. My first instinct was a cold, sharp spike of fear. If the Lottery Commission was investigating Mark's ticket, the authorities would be looking at everything associated with him. That included this apartment. That included our shared bank accounts, the ones we used for rent and groceries, not my private brokerage accounts, but the paper trail was there. I had $42 million, and if the IRS or the FBI started digging into the life of a simple admin whose boyfriend just cashed a fraudulent $15 million ticket, they would find my mountain of gold. In the eyes of the law, I wouldn't look like a genius trader. I'd look like a co-conspirator or a money launderer. I didn't have time to mourn the relationship or even enjoy the spite of Mark's departure. I had to move. I grabbed my emergency laptop, the one that had never touched the apartment's Wi-Fi, operating only on encrypted hotspots, and began the process of layering. Within minutes, I had moved the bulk of my liquid assets into a diversified series of offshore trusts and private equity holdings that would take a forensic accountant a decade to unspool. I wasn't hiding the money from the government. I paid my taxes, but I was hiding it from the immediate reach of a freeze order. While my fingers flew across the keys, I called Leo, my private investigator. "Tell me you're seeing the news," I said, my voice tight. "I'm seeing it," Leo growled. "Mark didn't just win, Sarah. He claimed a ticket that was reported stolen 3 days ago from a convenience store in the Heights. The clerk was pistol-whipped during the robbery. The guy who did it dropped the ticket in the parking lot. Mark must have picked it up." A sickening realization washed over me. Mark hadn't told me where he got the ticket. He'd just come home screaming that our lives were changed. He knew it was dirty. He'd seen the news of the robbery and realized he was holding the loot. Instead of turning it in, he'd waited for the heat to die down, then cashed it in, dumped me, and ran for the high life. "He's an idiot," I whispered. "He's a greedy, short-sighted idiot." "He's also a target," Leo added. "The guys who robbed that store? They're not exactly the type to let $15 million walk away because they dropped a piece of paper. They know who claimed it." Mark's face was on the local news for all of 10 minutes before the fraud investigation hit the wire. He's currently at the Grand Meridian penthouse, throwing a new life party. "Let him throw it," I said, a coldness settling into my bones. "I need you to scrub my connection to him. Close the joint accounts. Pay the remaining 6 months of the lease on the apartment in cash today, and get my name off the paperwork. I'm moving to the safe house." The safe house was a luxury condo I'd bought through a shell company 2 years ago, located in a building with biometric security and a 24-hour armed concierge. I'd never spent a night there. I'd kept it as a trophy of my success, a place I dreamed of moving Mark into once he proved himself. What a joke that was now. I packed my life into 2 suitcases. I left behind the thrifted blazers and the cheap furniture. I left the pasta on the stove. As I walked out the door, I took the check Mark had given me, the $50,000 of severance, and left it on the kitchen counter with a note, "You're going to need this for a lawyer or a casket." 3 hours later, I was standing on the balcony of my penthouse, 30 floors above the city. The wind whipped my hair as I stared at the lights of the Grand Meridian a few blocks away. I could see the strobe lights of Mark's party from here. He was probably popping champagne, surrounded by friends who only loved his balance sheet, completely unaware that the walls were closing in. I opened my laptop and pulled up the market. I wasn't done with him. Leaving me was one thing, but putting my entire financial empire at risk because of his criminal greed? That required a specific kind of retribution. I knew Mark's next move. He'd bragged about it for months, a revolutionary tech startup called Ethernet that he wanted to seed fund. He thought he was a venture capitalist now. I knew the founders of Ethernet. They were charlatans I'd been tracking for a short sell opportunity. Mark was about to pour $5 million of his winnings into a sinking ship. I began to execute a series of high-volume trades, systematically driving the sentiment of Ethernet's parent company into the dirt. I was going to ensure that by the time the police got to Mark, he wouldn't even have the money left to bribe a guard. I was going to bankrupt him before the law could handcuff him. My phone rang. It was Leo. "Sarah, we have a problem." "What? I'm busy, Leo." "The guys who robbed the store, they didn't go to the police, and they aren't waiting for the lottery commission to finish their investigation. I have eyes on the Grand Meridian. A black SUV just pulled into the private garage. 4 men, heavily armed. They didn't go through the lobby." My heart hammered. "They're going after the money." "They're going after the ticket holder," Leo corrected. "But Sarah, there's something else. I did a deep dive on the ticket's serial number. It wasn't just a random win. That ticket was part of a laundered batch used by a local cartel to move cash. Mark didn't just pick up a lucky break. He picked up a tracker." I stood up, moving toward the glass door of my balcony. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because," Leo's voice dropped to a whisper, "I just intercepted a signal. They aren't just at the Meridian. They tracked the secondary phone Mark used to call you right before he left. They think the partner has the rest of the offshore access." A cold shiver raced down my spine. I looked at the security feed of my own building on my tablet. A black SUV, identical to the one Leo described, was idling at my curb. The biometric lock on my front door hummed. It didn't turn green. It turned red, indicating a system override from the outside. Someone wasn't knocking. They were coming in, and they weren't the police. The red light on the biometric scanner pulsed like a dying heart. My breath hitched, but the panic didn't take over. Instead, a cold, analytical clarity settled in. In the world of high-stakes trading, panic is the quickest way to lose everything. I had built my fortune on managing risk, and I had prepared for a black swan event. I just hadn't expected the black swan to be wearing tactical gear and carrying a signal jammer. I didn't run for the front door. Instead, I dove for the master suite. Behind a seamless panel of walnut cabinetry in my walk-in closet lay the nerve center of my life. I pressed my palm against a hidden sensor, one that used subdermal mapping, far more advanced than the building's standard security. The panel slid back with a whisper, and I stepped into a room no larger than a pantry, lined with monitors and a dedicated satellite uplink. I slammed the door shut just as the sound of my front door being kicked in echoed through the penthouse. The heavy thud was followed by the rhythmic, disciplined footsteps of men who knew exactly how to clear a room. I looked at the monitors. 4 men dressed in charcoal gray moved through my living room with suppressed rifles. They weren't the disorganized street thugs Leo had described. These were professionals. The cartel hadn't sent hitters. They had sent a recovery team. "Clear!" one of them barked, his voice distorted by a throat mic. "Check the bedroom. The target's phone is active in this unit," another replied. I watched them on the silent screens. They moved with a terrifying efficiency, tossing my silk sheets, ripping the drawers from my nightstands. One of them stopped at my desk and picked up my primary laptop, the one displaying my brokerage accounts. "Boss, you need to see this," he said into his comms. He tapped a few keys, and though the screen was locked, the secondary monitor on the wall mirrored the login screen, which showed a censored version of the balance. Even with the asterisks, the number of digits was unmistakable. There was a long silence on the other end. Then, a new voice, deeper, calmer, and infinitely more dangerous, came through the speaker I'd tapped into. "That's not 15 million. That's significantly more. Where is she?" "She's here. The air conditioning is still running, and the coffee in the pot is warm. She didn't go out the front." I reached for my satellite phone and dialed Leo. "Leo, they're in the apartment. They've seen the accounts." "Sarah, listen to me." Leo's voice was frantic, drowned out by the sound of sirens in the background, sirens that were moving away from my location. "I've been blocked. Someone high up in the precinct just issued a stand-down order for your block. Gas leak, they're calling it. No one is coming. You need to use the service chute." "They're blocking the bedroom, Leo. I'm in the vault. If I open the door, I'm dead." "Then you have to negotiate," Leo said, his voice dropping. "They don't want a body, Sarah. They want the keys to the kingdom. But there's something else. I've got a feed from the Grand Meridian. Mark is... he's not a prisoner." My heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "I'm watching the lobby footage from 10 minutes ago. Mark walked out with them, Sarah. He wasn't in handcuffs. He was talking to the guy in charge. He looked... smug." The betrayal hit me harder than the sight of the rifles. Mark hadn't just found a stolen ticket. He hadn't just been a lucky idiot. He had been a pawn, and the moment he realized he was in over his head, he'd traded the only thing he had left of value: me. He knew I had money. He didn't know how much, but he knew I was stable. He must have told them I was his silent partner, the one who handled the real books. He'd painted a bullseye on my back to save his own skin. On the monitor, the leader of the team in my living room looked directly into one of my hidden cameras. He knew I was watching. He pulled a small device from his vest, a thermal imager. He began scanning the walls of the closet. "Sarah," the man said, his voice echoing in the small vault through the external speakers. "My name is Elias. I work for people who value discretion and ROI. Your boyfriend, Mark, has been very talkative. He told us you've been managing the proceeds of his recent windfall. But looking at your hardware, I suspect Mark is a very small fish in a very large pond." He stepped closer to the walnut panel, the thermal scanner turning bright orange where my body heat bled through the reinforced door. "We have a problem, Sarah. The 15 million Mark I actually belonged to my employers. It was meant to be a payment for a shipment that went sideways. Mark is currently downstairs in our vehicle. He's very eager to help us recover our funds, But I think you and I can strike a much better deal. You see, Mark is a liability. You, however, are an asset." He tapped the wall with the muzzle of his rifle. "Open the door, and we talk about a merger. Keep it closed, and I let the boys use the breaching charges. The shock wave in that small space will liquefy your internal organs. You have 10 seconds to decide if you're a traitor or a martyr." I looked at my screens. My finger hovered over a dead man's switch I'd programmed months ago, a command that would instantly shred my private keys and donate my entire $42 million fortune to a series of untraceable charities, leaving me with nothing but the clothes on my back. I could disappear. I could be poor again. I could leave Mark to the wolves. But then the monitor showing the street level flickered. A second black SUV pulled up, and the door opened. Mark stepped out, wearing a brand-new tailored suit, looking like he'd just won the lottery all over again. He looked up at my penthouse window and smiled, a cruel, triumphant grin. He wasn't a prisoner. He was a partner. He leaned over to the man standing next to him, a man whose face was scarred and weary, and pointed upward. "That's her," I heard through the intercepted audio. "That's the girl with the golden touch. She's worth way more than the 15. Just make sure you save a little of her for me to say goodbye to." The countdown on the door reached 0. "Time's up, Sarah," Elias said. I didn't hit the shred button. I didn't open the door. Instead, I grabbed the microphone for the room's external speakers. "Elias," I said, my voice as cold as a margin call. "You're right. I am an asset. But Mark is a counterfeit. Before you blow that door, you might want to check the balance of the account Mark gave you as collateral. I just finished a short sell on his entire life." Outside, Elias paused. He looked at his tablet. His eyes widened. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the building. But it wasn't my door. The floor beneath my feet groaned as a secondary blast tore through the lobby 40 stories below. "What the hell was that?" Elias barked into his radio. "Boss, we're under fire," a voice screamed through the comms. "It's not the cops, it's the Russians. They say Mark sold the same ticket information to them an hour ago." The lights in the vault flickered and died, plunging me into total darkness as the sound of heavy machine gun fire erupted in the hallway just outside my closet. Mark hadn't just betrayed me to one group. He'd tried to double-cross the two most dangerous syndicates in the city, and now they were both at my front door. The darkness of the vault was absolute, but the world outside was a symphony of violence. I could feel the vibrations through the reinforced floor, the heavy, rhythmic thud of a submachine gun, the sharper cracks of handguns, and the occasional bone-shaking roar of a breaching charge. The air in the small room grew hot and stale as the ventilation system, severed by the explosion below, gasped its last breath. I sat on the floor, the glow of my satellite tablet the only thing illuminating my face. On the screen, the thermal feed showed a chaotic ballet of orange and red figures. Elias's men had abandoned my vault door to take up defensive positions at the entrance of the suite. They were being hammered. The Russians, or whoever they were, had come in through the service elevator and the stairwell simultaneously. They were efficient, brutal, and they didn't care about the penthouse's art collection or the floor-to-ceiling glass. I watched a thermal figure in the hallway get hit, its heat signature blooming briefly before it slumped into a cold, dark heap. "Sarah," Elias's voice came over the speaker, strained and breathless. "The deal is changing. Open the door now or we leave you to them. They aren't looking to talk. They're clearing the floor with grenades." I didn't answer. I was busy. My fingers danced across the tablet, not looking at bank accounts, but at the building's integrated smart system. I had spent 6 figures on a custom home automation package when I bought this place, but I hadn't done it for the voice-controlled lights. I'd done it for the hardware. "Elias," I said, my voice echoing through the suite's intercom, "if you want to live, tell your men to drop to the floor and cover their eyes. Now." "What, Sarah, what are you—" "5 seconds, Elias. Do it or die." I didn't wait for his confirmation. I swiped a command on the tablet. In the living room, the ultra-high lumen circadian rhythm lighting system, designed to mimic natural sunlight, surged to 10 times its maximum capacity in a strobe pattern meant to induce disorientation and seizures. Simultaneously, I triggered the fire suppression system, not the sprinklers, but the halon gas reserve for the server room. The thermal feed went white as the sensors were overwhelmed. Screams drifted through the vault door, not screams of pain, but of pure, panicked confusion. The halon gas hissed into the hallway, sucking the oxygen out of the air to kill any potential flames. It was a lethal move for anyone caught in it without a mask, but it would stop the Russians from firing their weapons. I stood up, grabbed my emergency respirator from the wall, and punched the manual override for the vault door. The door slid open. The penthouse was a graveyard of white fog and blinding light. I stepped out, the respirator hissing with every breath I took. I moved like a ghost through the living room. I saw one of Elias's men on his knees, clawing at his throat, his eyes wide and unseeing in the strobe. I didn't stop to help. I headed for the service chute Leo had mentioned. It wasn't a garbage slide. It was a hidden, high-speed lift disguised as a linen closet, designed for the discreet movement of high-value residents. As I reached the closet door, a hand clamped onto my ankle. I gasped, looking down. It was Elias. He had managed to get his tactical mask on in time, but he was pinned under a fallen bookshelf. His rifle was gone, his hand trembling as he gripped my boot. "Take me with you," he wheezed through his mask. I looked at him, then at the hallway where the fog was starting to clear. The Russians would be recovering soon. I reached down, not to pull him up, but to grab the tablet he had dropped. It was linked to the cartel's local network. "You should have stayed a traitor, Elias," I whispered, the sound muffled by my own mask. "In this market, you're a falling knife, and you never catch a falling knife." I kicked my foot free and stepped into the service lift. The doors hissed shut just as the first spray of gunfire chewed through the wood of the closet. The lift dropped with a stomach-churning lurch, bypassing the lobby and plunging straight into the sub-basement. My mind was already 3 steps ahead. I needed to get to the secondary garage, take the nondescript sedan I'd kept there for 2 years, and disappear into the city's industrial district. But as the lift reached the basement and the doors opened, I wasn't greeted by an empty concrete garage. The lights were on, bright, cold, fluorescent tubes. And there, leaning against my getaway car, was Mark. He wasn't wearing the suit anymore. He was in a tactical vest, a heavy black pistol tucked into a holster at his hip. He looked different. The clueless boyfriend mask had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness that I had never seen in 3 years of living with him. Behind him, 2 men I didn't recognize were loading crates into a van, crates that bore the logo of the Lottery Commission. "Hello, Sarah," Mark said, his voice smooth and devoid of the whine he used to have when he wanted me to pay the electric bill. "I figured you'd use the service lift. It's the only play a smart person like you would make." I stared at him, my heart freezing. "The lottery, the robbery. It was you. You didn't find the ticket." Mark laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Find it? Sarah, I staged the robbery. The cartel and the Russians upstairs. They're just 2 different departments of the same organization. I needed a war to mask the transfer. I needed a distraction so big that $15 million in physical assets could move out of the city without a single pair of eyes on them." He stepped toward me, his eyes scanning me with a terrifying intensity. "But then I found out about your little hobby. $42 million. You've been holding out on me, Sarah, all those years of tuna sandwiches and thrift stores while you were sitting on a mountain of gold. I was the safety net, Mark. I was building a future for us," I shouted, though even to my ears it sounded like a lie now. "No, you were the hedge," Mark corrected, stopping just a few feet away. "You were keeping me small so you could feel big, but the market has shifted." He reached out and took the tablet from my hand, the one I'd taken from Elias. He tapped a few keys, and I saw my own brokerage app open. He didn't have my password, but he didn't need it. He held the tablet up to my face. "Biometric override," he whispered. The tablet hummed as it scanned my retinas. The screen turned green. "Access granted. Now," Mark said, his smile returning. The same cruel, triumphant grin I'd seen from the balcony. "We're going to transfer those assets to a cold wallet. And then, Sarah, we're going to see how well you can trade your life for a head start." He gestured to the van. "Get in. We're going to the docks. And if I don't—" Mark pulled the pistol from his holster and aimed it at my forehead. "Then the fraud investigation ends here with a tragic murder-suicide of two lottery-obsessed lovers. Your choice." I looked at the van, then at the man I thought I loved. But as I walked toward the open doors, I felt a familiar vibration in my pocket. It wasn't my phone. It was the remote trigger for the dead man switch I'd hidden in the car's ignition. I stepped into the van, and as Mark followed me, his face illuminated by the greed of $42 million, I realized he had made one fatal mistake. He thought he was the one controlling the volatility. But the van's doors didn't close. Instead, a voice boomed over the garage's PA system, a voice that sounded exactly like mine but colder. "System breach detected. Initiating total asset liquidation and building lockdown in T-minus 60 seconds. Mark froze, his eyes darting to the ceiling. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything, Mark," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face as the sound of a dozen police sirens suddenly erupted from the garage's entrance ramps. "But Leo, he's always been very good at his job. And he just told the FBI that you're the one holding the stolen ticket and the cartel's laundry list." The garage doors began to rumble shut, sealing us all inside. But Mark wasn't looking at the doors. He was looking at his tablet. "The money!" he screamed. "It's gone! The balance is zero!" "I told you," I whispered. "I short-sold your life, and the margin call just arrived." The first flashbang detonated at the far end of the garage. But as the smoke cleared, I realized the people coming through the doors weren't wearing FBI jackets. They were wearing the same charcoal gray as Elias's team, and they were pointing their weapons at everyone. The garage was swallowed by a wall of white light and a sound so loud it felt like a physical blow to the chest. The flashbang did its job, blinding everyone for 3 critical seconds. In that window of sensory chaos, I didn't reach for Mark's gun or try to run for the closing garage doors. Instead, I dove under the chassis of the van, pressing my body into the oil-stained concrete. When the ringing in my ears faded, I heard a new voice. It was calm, clipped, and possessed an authority that made Elias sound like a schoolyard bully. "Mark, put the weapon down. You're holding a piece of hardware you don't have the clearance to fire, aiming it at an asset you don't have the intellect to replace." I peered out from under the van. A man in a tailored charcoal suit, not tactical gear, but a 3-piece that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, stepped into the light. He wasn't wearing a mask. He didn't need one. His face was a map of cold, calculated experience. This was the man behind the curtain. This was the board of directors for the money Mark had tried to steal. Mark was shaking, his pistol wobbling as he looked between the newcomer and the gray-clad mercenaries who now surrounded the van. "I have the money. I have her. 42 million plus the 15. It's all right here." He waved the tablet frantically. "The tablet says 0, Mark," the man in the suit said, his voice dripping with pity. "And do you know why? Because Sarah isn't a thief. She's a market maker. You, on the other hand, are just a bad trade, and my organization has a very strict policy regarding bad trades. We liquidate them." "Wait!" I shouted, sliding out from under the van. I stood up, brushing the grit from my clothes, keeping my hands visible. "He's right. The balance is 0, but it's not gone. It's in a transition state." The man in the suit turned his gaze to me. His eyes were like flint. Explain, Sarah. I'm interested in why you didn't just run. Because I know how you think, I said, my heart hammering but my voice steady. You don't want a bloodbath in a residential basement. You want your $15 million back and you want the interest. Mark thought he was stealing from you. I, however, have been using his win as a hedge. I didn't just watch him. I tracked the source of that ticket. I followed the digital breadcrumbs of your laundry operation. Mark stared at me, his mouth agape. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that your $15 million was actually part of a larger pool of $38 million being moved through lottery front-end shells, I said, looking directly at the man in the suit. While Mark was playing gangster, I was shorting the shell companies you used to move that cash. I've effectively frozen your entire regional liquid supply. If I don't punch in a secondary code in the next 5 minutes, that money doesn't just disappear. It gets flagged by the SEC, the IRS, and Interpol simultaneously. A scorched earth protocol. The man in the suit tilted his head, a ghost of a smile appearing on his thin lips. You took our laundry list and turned it into a ransom note. I turned it into an insurance policy, I corrected. I don't want your money. I have my own. Much more than Mark ever dreamed of. What I want is a clean exit. I want Mark to face the consequences of his own actions, and I want to walk out of here with my accounts intact and my name scrubbed from your files. And if I refuse? The man asked. Then you lose $38 million and your entire infrastructure in this city. You'll be too busy dealing with federal warrants to care about a bad trade like me. The silence in the garage was deafening. Mark looked between us, the realization finally dawning on him that he was the only one in the room who wasn't playing the real game. He was a pawn who thought he was a king, standing in a room full of grandmasters. "You bitch," Mark hissed, turning the gun back toward me. "You've been playing me from the start. You never loved me. You were just waiting for a chance to—" Crack. A single shot echoed through the garage. Mark's knees buckled. He didn't fall because he was hit. He fell because the mercenary behind him had put a bullet through the tablet in Mark's hand, shattering the screen and the dream along with it. Mark, the man in the suit, said, "You're boring. Sarah, however, is a revelation." He gestured to his men. "Take him. He can spend the rest of his very short life explaining to our collection department where he thought he was going to hide." 2 men grabbed Mark by the arms, dragging him toward the back of the garage. He didn't scream. He didn't fight. He just looked broken, a hollowed-out shell of a man who had finally realized that the jackpot was a trap he'd set for himself. The man in the suit stepped closer to me. He held out a hand. "The code, Sarah, and in exchange, the garage door opens and you are officially off the books. We will consider your short position a very expensive consulting fee." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small encrypted thumb drive. "The keys to the shell companies are on here. The shorts will expire at midnight, returning the liquidity to your accounts, minus my fee, of course. And don't bother trying to follow me. If my heartbeat sensor doesn't check in with my private server every hour for the next week, the evidence of your operation goes to the New York Times." The man took the drive, his eyes reflecting a grudging respect. "You should have been born in my world, Sarah. You have the ice for it." "I prefer the stock market," I said, stepping back toward the service elevator. "The stakes are higher, and the people are generally better dressed." The garage door behind me began to rise. The sirens I'd heard earlier were now loud and real. Leo had finally brought the cavalry, but not to my floor. He had directed them to the Grand Meridian, where the after party was being raided, creating the perfect smokescreen for my departure. I walked out into the cool night air of the city. I didn't look back at the garage or the van or the man who had been my life for 3 years. I walked 3 blocks to a waiting car, a simple, unassuming electric vehicle driven by Leo. "You okay?" Leo asked as I slid into the passenger seat. "I'm $42 million okay, Leo," I said, opening my laptop. I looked at the screen. The markets were just opening in Tokyo. I watched the numbers flicker, green and red, a digital heartbeat of a world that didn't care about heartbreak or betrayal or lottery tickets. I looked at a final alert on my screen. It was a news clip from an hour ago. Mark's face was on the screen, labeled as a person of interest in a massive fraud and organized crime investigation. He was being led into a black SUV by men who definitely weren't the police. I closed the tab. I had spent 3 years dimming my light so a small man could feel tall. I had played the role of the boring admin while I built an empire in the shadows. Mark thought he had won the jackpot when he found a stolen ticket. He thought he was leveling up by leaving me behind. He never realized that the greatest asset he ever had wasn't the ticket in his hand. It was the woman standing next to him. But in the end, the market always corrects itself. I tapped a key, executing a massive buy order on a tech stock I'd been watching for months. As the trade cleared, the balance on my screen ticked up, 45 million. I leaned back against the headrest and watched the city lights blur past. The jackpot was a joke. The real gain was finally being free to play the game at my own speed, and I was just getting started.